Good morning. Our text is going to be from Matthew chapter 20. So if you have your Bibles, please open with me to Matthew chapter 20. We're going to be reading verses 25 through 28. Matthew 20, 25 through 28. There's a story by Hermann Hesse. It's about a group of men who go on a journey to the east. And this journey is sponsored or supported by this religious group that they belong to. And this religious order sends them a servant by the name of Leo to accompany them on their journey, to carry their bags, carry their luggage, to do the kind of things that these men don't want to do. And so Leo, the servant, happily does it. And Leo has an attitude, a spirit about him that is extraordinary. He is the one who encourages them along this journey. He's the one who really holds them together as a unit. And at first, the journey's going well. Everything is going as it should. But one day, as they're crossing a ravine, Leo disappears. And as soon as Leo disappears, everything falls apart. The men begin to bicker, they begin to argue, they're blaming each other for why things are going wrong, and before long, they've completely lost their sense of direction entirely. They forget where they're going, they forget why they're going, and they eventually abandon the journey altogether. They go their separate ways, they lose connection with each other, and for several years, they don't see each other again. And one day, one of the men from the group, a man by the name of H.H., he is trying to piece together what happened. Why did the journey fail? Why did they abandon this pilgrimage that was so important to them? And he happens to come across and reconnect with Leo. And he asks Leo, what happened? Where did we go wrong? And Leo takes him to the headquarters of the religious order that had sponsored their journey to the east. And when he arrives at the headquarters, H.H. learns that Leo was not a servant after all. As it turns out, Leo was the president of the entire religious league. This humble, self-effacing servant, or who appeared to be a servant, was in reality the group's true leader. And that is why whenever Leo disappeared from the group could not go on. It's because they did not realize it, but that he had been their leader. He had been the one who was really holding everything together and who was charting their course. And the reason I tell you this story is because it challenges our assumptions about leadership. It challenges our assumptions about who a leader is and what a leader does. We don't think of men who behave like Leo as being leaders. We think of them as being servants. We think of leaders as being more assertive, more dominant, more self-confident than Leo seemed to be. But if the fact that Leo was the leader surprises us, it may be that our notions of leadership are simply misguided. This morning I saw an article. It was actually from June, but I didn't see it till this morning. It was from Forbes. And they say that there is a workplace leadership crisis. That was the title of the article. There is a workplace leadership crisis. And they include a Gallup poll, and that Gallup poll was very concerning. In that Gallup poll, they found that only 21% of employees strongly agree that they trust their company's leadership. Only 21% strongly agree that they trust their company's leadership. 39% feel more comfortable asking artificial intelligence for advice or support over their manager. I thought this was interesting. 10% of Gen Zs would actually rather have AI for a manager than their current boss. Maybe that says more about Gen Z than it says about their leaders. But in any case, that does not look good for today's leaders. That is, I think, an indication of a leadership crisis. I believe that the root of this crisis, what is causing such a mistrust of leaders, whether it be in the workplace, in our government, in our church, in the home, the reason for the mistrust of our leaders is because the prevailing approach to leadership is self-centered. It is self-serving. It is self-absorbed. And it completely defies God's design for leadership. And it creates doubt and mistrust for God's design for leadership. The wise man says in Proverbs 29:2, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. When leaders are good, when leaders are serving those whom they lead, things go great. Things are going very smoothly whenever we have the righteous who are at the helm. But when a wicked man rules, the wise man says, the people groan. And clearly, there is much groaning that is going on today concerning the lack of leadership. Not just in the workplace. I believe that this is a universal issue. We see it in our government, we see it in churches, we even see it in the home. We just concluded a series on domestic abuse. And I believe that the issue, it's a complicated issue, and I know it's not just one thing, but I believe that at its core, it is an abuse and a misuse of leadership. It is a perversion of what God intended a leader to be in a family. And so it is of the utmost importance that we restore a scriptural understanding of what a leader is. What is a leader supposed to look like, biblically speaking? Well, Jesus tells us here in Matthew chapter 20. In Matthew chapter 20, after James and John are trying to assert themselves and to make themselves the leaders, they want to be the ones who are at his left hand and at his right hand in his kingdom. In fact, they have their mother ask Jesus for them, it seems. And so they must have felt maybe some shame in asking for this. I don't know. Maybe they thought that Jesus was less likely to rebuke them if their mom asked for them. I don't know. In any case, they're clearly manifesting the wrong approach to leadership, a self-centered approach to leadership. And so Jesus takes them aside in verse 25. He called them to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The beauty of Jesus' revelation here, the lesson here, is that he's not just telling them how to lead. He is showing them how to lead by his own example. He does not just tell them to lead by serving. He tells them, lead as I am leading you. He's saying, lead like me, even as I came not to be served, but to serve, and to give my life a ransom for many. And this morning, I want us to consider what this means in the context of leadership. I want us to consider how we can lead like the Lord. The Lord is showing us here very clearly what it means to be a leader. And I believe that if every leader operates based upon these principles, if every leader will lead like the Lord, then the people will rejoice. They will not groan. People will not doubt their leaders. They will not doubt God's design for leadership. They will rejoice. They will be happy. They will feel safe and secure and protected by those whom God has placed in power. And so this morning we're going to be considering 3 ways in which we can lead like the Lord. And I want to emphasize that this is not just for people who are in formal positions of power, not just for elders and employers or teachers and coaches. I definitely think that if you are in a more formal role of leadership, this will be very applicable. But I want to emphasize throughout this lesson that every single one of us is a leader in some capacity. Maybe you are an older sibling. Maybe you have a group of friends at school or on your team or in some context in your home. Even if you are just leading in a very, very small, informal capacity, you need to know how to lead the way the Lord leads. And so this morning, that is what I want to show you, is how to lead like the Lord. So let's start out by considering the first way in which we can lead like the Lord. The first way that we lead like the Lord is to lead by following. We lead like the Lord when we lead by following. And that sounds like an oxymoron, a contradiction. How can you lead by following? Those are distinct activities. A leader is not a follower. And if you're following, you can't be leading. But what I want you to understand is that we cannot be the kind of leaders that God would have us to be unless we become the followers that He would have us to be. Aristotle said, "He who cannot be a good follower cannot be a good leader." I've worked for people who are, they're people who are very ambitious and they're very hardworking, and they're the type that I guess you'd say there's business people I think who will succeed in business because they can't stand to work for anyone else, and so they go and they start their own business. And in many ways, we admire that because we think, well, look, they're a go-getter and they're ambitious and all of that. But I think that it's an issue whenever someone can't stand to follow someone else. Whenever somebody feels as though they have to lead, as if they are above following someone else. Because the truth is that there is no such thing as a born leader. There is this notion that someone is born a leader, that they are born with this set of personality traits, this certain charisma that makes a leader, and they're just destined to be a leader. And that's just not true. We're born followers. That is why God gives us parents. That is why God gives us older people in our lives who lead us and who train us up so that we are eventually capable of leading families of our own, leading others as well. And I want to emphasize that it is a major problem if you resist being led. If you resist being led, you are not going to make for a very good leader. I want you to think about Korah, who refused to follow the leadership of Moses and Aaron, who did not assert themselves as leaders, who God had placed over him as a leader. And Korah did not like that. Korah wanted to be high priest. He didn't like that Aaron was the high priest, and he felt that he should be the leader. He didn't like feeling inferior to his cousins. And so he led this revolt, he led this rebellion, and it resulted in his own destruction. God opened up the ground beneath him, and it swallowed him up. And so what we need to learn is that followership comes first. We cannot lead until we have proven ourselves capable of following. And biblical leadership begins with biblical followership. I want you to think of a few examples with me of men who were not just leading, but leading by following. Think about Joshua. Joshua, who was a remarkable leader. I mean, out of all the Old Testament leaders, Joshua was, I think, one of the most honorable men that we find. He is the one who led the Israelites into the Promised Land. He's the one who conquered the Canaanites, who really finished the work that Moses had began. He was a leader par excellence. And yet Joshua reveals that he was not a leader primarily, but a follower. He says in Joshua 24:15, "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Joshua was a good leader because he was a good follower. He was not just leading Israel, he was serving the Lord. And that is what made him qualified to lead God's people. That is what made him the man that he was. And all of his victories, all of his success was the result of this principle, that he was committed first to following the Lord. Paul shows us likewise in 1 Corinthians 11. Paul, who was a remarkable leader himself, an apostle, a man entrusted with an enormous amount of authority, and yet he tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 11:1, "Imitate me just as I also imitate Christ." Paul is saying, follow me to the extent that I am following Christ. He is showing us that leaders, biblical leaders, are followers first. And their effectiveness as a leader is in proportion to their effectiveness as a follower. And clearly, this is in the context of their relationship with God. That is the most important following that we must pursue. That is the most important leader that we can have, is to imitate Christ, to follow the Lord, to serve Him as Joshua did. But the best example we have of leading by following is none other than Jesus Himself, who said in the book of John 6:38, "For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of Him who sent me." Jesus over and over again insisted that His leadership, His messiahship, was not Him just doing things His own way, not just Him flexing His own authority, not just Him flexing His own power, but Him doing the will of the Father who sent Him. And my point is this: if Jesus is not above following, then neither are we. If Jesus, as a grown man, was submitting Himself to followership, then we too must submit ourselves to followership. And this means that you need to let God lead you before you lead others. We cannot lead others unless God is leading us himself. James tells us in James 4:10, he says, in James 4:10, he tells us to humble ourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. This is the first step before we can really excel as leaders in whatever capacity that looks like, whether that's in our family, in the church, in the workplace, on the football field, wherever that is. That needs to begin by first humbling ourselves, subjecting ourselves to the Lord's tutelage, to his wisdom, to his word, and following him. And then that is what is going to make us effective as a leader. And the reason that I emphasize this first is because this is really where leadership begins. This is where we get our direction as leaders. You cannot lead unless you know where you are going. And only God can show you where you are going. Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 10:23, I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself, that it is not in man who walks to direct his steps. If you lead without following the Lord, then you are going to be flying blind. And Jesus warns us. He says, if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. Much of the groaning, much of the frustration with many of our modern leaders today is because they are blind. They don't know where they're going. They're pretending. They're faking it, but they do not have any direction. And that's why we need leaders who are following the Lord, who are not trusting in their own might, not trusting in their own wisdom, not trusting in their own capabilities, but who are trusting in the Lord and whose strength is in him. So you need to let God lead you before you presume to lead others. It says over in John 8:12, Jesus assures us, he says, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus is saying that he is the secret, he is the answer to the direction that we need. He is the one who will illuminate our path so that we can see where we are going and we can help others to get there as well. And so we need to start out by letting God lead us. And whenever you do that, not only will you have direction, not only will you know where you are going, but your leadership will become an extension of God's leadership. And that needs to be our goal as leaders, is to not just lead for its own sake, but to lead others so that we can lead them closer to God, so that our leadership is in some way an extension of God's leadership. Over in the book of Psalms, Psalm 77, it says, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. God was leading his people through Moses and Aaron. Moses and Aaron were the leaders. That is who God chose to lead them out of Egypt, to lead them through the wilderness. But ultimately, because they were following the Lord was leading his people through them. Their leadership was an extension of God's leadership. And so that needs to be the ultimate goal when we lead. It is not just to lead based upon our own preferences, our own style, or whatever we think is most important, but that we are seeking to lead others closer to God, that we are seeking his direction, seeking his wisdom, and that we are seeking to make our leadership reflective of his leadership. And this also means not just letting God lead you, but letting others lead you as well. There's never going to come a point in your life where there is not somebody from whom you can learn. There's not somebody who is qualified to lead you. It says in Hebrews 13:7, remember your leaders, consider the outcome of their way of life, and imitate their faith. We are born followers and we stay followers throughout our lives. Even after we have maybe outgrown the period of childhood in which we are living under our parents' roof, our parents still have a lot to offer us in terms of guidance, in terms of wisdom. The elders are God's selected shepherds and overseers, and they have been entrusted with leadership, and we are to submit to them. There are older members who have much to teach us, older women, older men who are like fathers and mothers in this church, who we need to follow, who we need to learn from. And so this is where leadership begins. It begins by following, and that following should not stop. We should not get to a point in which we are leading exclusively. We should always be following the Lord and following those whom he has put over us. And so we need to lead by following. Second, we need to lead by example. We need to lead by our example. In the world, there is a lot of emphasis on dominance and on authority and exercising authority. That is what Jesus says in verse 25 of our text. He says that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. They use force and fear and manipulation to get people to do what they want them to do. And Jesus says, it shall not be so among you. It is not supposed to be like that. We should not be leading through these manipulative ways in which we are trying to force somebody to do what we want them to do, force someone to do what we want them to do, or force someone to follow us. Instead, we need to be relying on the merit of our example, not on how we can maybe pressure someone or force someone or coerce someone into following, as we saw in our text earlier. Instead, Peter tells us, speaking to the elders, there needs to be an emphasis on influence and example. He says in 1 Peter 5, 1 through 3, he says, so I exhort the elders among you to shepherd the flock as God would have you, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples. He's contrasting these two different approaches to leadership. Domineering is the way that the Gentiles are seeking to lead. They're lording their authority over others. That's the exact same word that is used over in chapter 20 of our text in Matthew, this word that's translated domineering here. It means that they are trying to get their way by force. They're trying to get their way through just ungodly ways. Peter is saying, don't do it that way. You need to be examples. You need to rely on your influence. And that is something that we see over and over again throughout the Bible, is godly leaders using not dominance, not force, not fear, but using the power of their example to influence others. Look at Paul in the book of Philemon. He tells Philemon in chapter 1, verse 8, he says, though I am bold enough in Christ to command you to do what is required, yet for love's sake I prefer to appeal to you. That is far more effective when it comes to influencing people, is to rely on actually appealing to them, exhorting them, trying to influence them, not trying to force them and command them. I'm not saying that there's never a time for maybe a more heavy-handed use of authority. There are times where maybe a parent needs to lay down the law with the child, and I'm not denying that need is there in certain cases, but that should not be what we default to. And in fact, that should be hopefully far more rare than it is common. What it should be is an influential, more example where we are showing the way instead of telling the way. Paul says in Acts 20:35, he says, in all things I have shown you that by working hard in this way, we must help the weak. Paul did not just tell them what to do, he showed them what to do. He gave them example, he influenced them with that example. But of course, the ultimate example of this is the Lord. Jesus says in John 13:15, after he had washed the disciples' feet, he says, for I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Jesus could have just told them, you guys need to serve each other. You guys need to wash each other's feet. But instead, he got down on his knees, he took a towel and a bowl, and he did it himself. And he said, do as I have done to you. That is far more powerful than leading by telling. It is far more powerful than leading by dominance. Influence and example. It's more challenging. It takes more time. It takes more effort. But it is far more effective. It is far more effective. And so what I'm getting at here is that not only do you need to let God lead you first, but you need to lead yourself first before you lead others. You need to lead with your life. Your life needs to be such that people can trust you, that they look to you and that they see that you are walking your talk and that you are actually living by the principles that you are preaching, living by the principles that you are putting before those whom you follow. One man said, would you have a great empire? Rule over thyself. And so it's not about trying to just put yourself forward and trying to assert yourself, but disciplining yourself, mastering yourself so that your life is in harmony with the Lord's, so that you are actually qualified to lead, so that you are not just the blind leading the blind, but that you are somebody who are showing by your example the way that you are going. And as I said, this is far more challenging, but it's far more effective, but it's also far more accessible. Anybody can lead by their example. You don't have to have a specific title. You don't have to have a particular office or any formal authority whatsoever to lead with your example. Anybody can lead with their example. That's why Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:12, he says, let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. Timothy was not an elder. Timothy was not in a formal position of authority per se, but he was still expected to set an example, to lead by his example, and to influence others by that example. And so that's why I said at the beginning that this is not just for people who are in formal positions of leadership. Every single one of us is commanded to be an example, and we are going to, for better or worse, lead people with that example. And we need to be conscientious of that, and we need to invest ourselves in cultivating an example that is worthy of being followed. And so we need to lead not just by following, but by our example. Finally, and most importantly, and most relevant to our text, we need to lead by serving. We need to lead by serving. This is, I think, the ultimate point in our text in Matthew chapter 20, is that leadership, the ultimate purpose of leadership, is not to be served, but to serve, as Jesus said. He says, "Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be your slave." See, the typical approach to leadership is backwards, and that's the problem with it, ultimately, is that the typical approach to leadership is it is a means to an end, and that end is not in the best interest of those who are being led. It is in the best interest of the leader himself or herself. It is for the leader to enjoy the status, to enjoy the benefits of being the leader at the expense of their followers. And God rebukes this kind of leadership. He says through the mouth of Ezekiel, in the book of Ezekiel, he says in chapter 34:2, he says, "Ah, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding yourselves, should not shepherds feed the sheep?" God is pointing out to them the backwards nature of their leadership, that they were stripping the sheep, that they were essentially using the sheep for their own gain, when in reality God had put them in as leaders to protect the sheep, to feed the sheep. That is what a leader is supposed to do. And because they had failed to uphold their duty as a leader, God tells them over in verse 10, he says, "Behold, I am against the shepherds, and I will require my sheep at their hand." Jesus said, "To whom much is given, much will be required." And leaders who use their position to hurt others, to benefit themselves, are going to stand before God, and they are going to be condemned for it. God says, "I will require my sheep at their hand." This is not what leadership is for. The shepherds are to feed the sheep, not themselves. And the reason that God despises this approach to leadership is because it completely misses the point of why leadership exists in the first place. And Paul spells this out for us very clearly in the book of 2 Corinthians. It says over in 2 Corinthians 13:10, he says, "For this reason I write these things, that when I come, I may not have to be severe in my use of the authority that the Lord has given me for building up and not for tearing down." Paul is not only showing us here that he did not want to have to use dominance and any sort of severity with his authority. He is also showing us why the Lord had given him that authority in the first place. And it was for the building up of those whom he led, not for their tearing down. Paul was an apostle not to serve himself, but to serve those who were under his charge. And he's making it very clear that when God gives authority, whenever he makes you a leader, it is for building up those whom you lead, not for tearing them down, not for serving yourself. And we have so many wonderful examples throughout the Bible of men and women who display this mentality of servant leadership. Think about Joseph, who was one of the first major world leaders we see in the Bible, at least one of the first major godly leaders that we see in the Bible. And in Genesis 50, after his brothers realize how powerful Joseph is, and they remember how they had hurt Joseph, and they're afraid that Joseph's going to use his power and his authority to hurt them, Joseph assures them in Genesis 50, he says, "Do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Joseph is saying not only is he not going to use his leadership selfishly to hurt them, to get vengeance and to get back at them, but he's going to use it to serve them, to provide for them and their families. This is servant leadership. Mordecai, we see the exact same thing. Mordecai, who was made the prime minister over Persia, it says in Esther 10:3, was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people. Not his own welfare, but the welfare of his people. Mordecai was popular, he was effective as a leader because he understood why he was a leader. He understood what leadership was about. It was about seeking the welfare of those whom he led. Paul likewise viewed himself as a servant. His self-concept was not as a leader, but ultimately as a servant. In 1 Corinthians 4:1, he says, "This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God." At Corinth, there was this division that was happening because people were following these different party leaders. And I don't know if Paul and Peter and Apollos were just used as examples or if people were actually trying to follow them as distinct leaders. But Paul makes it very clear that this is not how God intends for leaders to lead. He does not intend for there to be division. He does not intend for leaders to assert themselves, but rather to be servants and stewards of God. And that is how Paul handled himself as a leader. But ultimately, we see this concept of servant leadership in the master leader himself in our text when he says, "Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And so if Jesus led in this way, then we too must lead by serving. We must become a servant. We must become a slave. And only by so doing will we become the kind of leaders that the Lord would have us to be. So we lead others by letting God lead us. We lead others by leading with our life. But ultimately we lead others by losing our life, by losing ourself. Scriptural leadership, like love, does not insist on its own way. We need to understand that if God has given us the opportunity to lead somebody else, then it is for their good and not for our own. And we need to sacrifice our own preferences, sacrifice our own will, so that they would gain from it, so that they would benefit from it. In Philippians, it says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves." This applies to every Christian. This is not just written to leaders, but this applies especially to those who have been entrusted with the position of leadership. God expects a greater degree of sacrifice, a greater degree of humility from those who are leaders. That's why he tells husbands in Ephesians 5:25, "Love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." That is the essence of leading in the home. It is not about asserting. It is not about dominating, threatening, manipulating. It is about giving yourself up for the good of your wife and children, giving yourself up for the good of the flock, the church, giving yourself up for whoever it is that you are leading, and sacrificing your preferences for their own benefit and good. And so the true test of leadership then is the well-being of those who you lead. It's hard to find a metric for leaders of what makes a good leader. And a lot of times with CEOs, it's their financial metrics. It's, well, how good did we do this quarter? And then, if it was a good quarter, then, well, leadership is doing what they ought to do. If it was a bad quarter, then, well, we need new leaders. And that's a very poor metric for a leader. The best metric for a leader is the well-being of those whom they are leading. Robert Greenleaf said, the best test is this: do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, and more likely themselves to become servants? That is the real test of leadership. Is not just physically, but spiritually, how well are those who are being led doing? Are they thriving or are they suffering? Are they growing or are they growing weaker? That is the true test of a leader's effectiveness, and that is how we need to measure ourselves as leaders. And so who is the true leader then? The true leader, according to Pollard, is not the person with the most distinguished title, not the person with the highest pay or the longest tenure, but the role model, the risk taker, the servant. Not the person who promotes himself or herself, but the promoter of others. This is what it means to lead like the Lord. It is to lead by following, to submit our lives to the Lord and to let him lead us first so that we have the direction that we need and so that our leadership can become an extension of his leadership. It is to lead by example, not to rely on force or manipulation or any underhanded tactics, but to rely on the merit of our example, our reputation, and the trust that we cultivate with those whom we lead. But ultimately, to lead like the Lord means that we lead by serving, that we put all of our preferences to the side, and that we devote ourselves solely to enriching the lives of those whom we lead. That is what it means to lead like the Lord. As we conclude, I want to leave you with a dilemma that one leader was faced with. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, had the challenge of following in his father's footsteps. Solomon was not a perfect leader. We know that Solomon made some very big mistakes during his tenure as a king, but Solomon was one of the greatest, aside from David, one of the greatest leaders that Israel had ever known. And now Rehoboam is succeeding to the throne, and he is ascended, and now he is faced with this dilemma because the people approach him. They essentially ask him, what kind of leader are you going to be? And they tell him that his father had been too harsh, and his father had been too severe with them. They promised Rehoboam that if he would lighten their load, if he would lead them gently and compassionately, that they would serve him. And to his credit, Rehoboam has the good sense to seek counsel. Although Rehoboam was the most powerful man in the land at this time, he realized he was not above followership. He was not above guidance. And so he goes to his father's counselors. He presents them with this dilemma, and he asks them, how should I answer? What kind of leader should I be? They say to him in 1 Kings 12:7, they say, if you will be a servant to this people and serve them, then they will be your servants forever. These elders understood that in order for Rehoboam to succeed as a leader, he had to become a servant. And if he would become a servant, then he could be the leader that he intended to be. The people would serve him forever. He would have their undying allegiance and loyalty. And so Rehoboam thinks it over. He gets more advice. And ultimately, he rejects the wise advice of his elders. And he tells the people essentially, if you thought my dad was harsh, well, he says, I'm going to be even more strict. He tells them essentially that he's not going to abide by their requests, and he's going to lead the way that he wants to lead. He's going to dominate, he's going to flex his authority, and they are going to just have to fall in line. And do you know what happened to Rehoboam when he did that? His leadership was stripped from him. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel walked away from his kingdom. And from that point forward, the kingdom was divided, and it was never reunited the same. And so the lesson from this whole ordeal, from Rehoboam's mistake, is that in order to be a leader, you must be a servant. The wise men said, if you will be a servant to this people and serve them, then they will be your servants forever. Leadership without service is leadership without a purpose. And only the leader who serves will last. This concludes our study. At this time, if you have not obeyed the gospel, we want to invite you to follow the master leader, the leader who we are striving to follow ourselves, and that is Jesus Christ. And Jesus has made very clear to us that he has died for our sins and that he is coming back and that he will save those who belong to him. And if you have not yet obeyed the gospel, then you do not yet belong to him, but you can this morning. If you would like to, you can come forward, you can confess your faith that Jesus is the Christ, repenting of your sins and being baptized for the forgiveness of those sins. If that is something that you wish to do, we ask that you would come forward at this time as we stand and sing.